on each of, probably mostly the bail reform, but some of the other legislations as well, to share about what those legislations are, what they were meant to do, and then hopefully be able to share a little bit about if there are some unintended consequences. I know what we continue to feel here in the community is violent crime, and I know one of the things that we've heard, on a regular basis is, an example would be, well, I just think back for many years, right? It has been that kind of sanctuary places are your home, school, places of worship. And recently, we've seen many more homes get shot into. We've heard from law enforcement that unless someone is hit, that's reckless endangerment, and the individual who commits that crime could be out the same day or the next day. That's an example of a violent crime. It doesn't make sense how that individual may be able to get out. I'm recapping some of the things that we've been hearing and discussing here in our meetings. So hopefully we can hear from our legislators in terms of what is going on, what they may be doing to really make sure that public safety is able to be to the standard where we all expect. But at the same time, as was shared earlier, we certainly don't think someone who steals a Snickers bar should be in jail for a year, right? Like, that doesn't make sense either. So where is that balance? Where are we? So I want to say thank you. I think you guys are coming back from Albany today, right? Were you in Albany? Or no, that was the Senate? Okay. So I know you've been busy. I know there's a lot going on, but that we would have our two assembly representatives that oversee Beechwood are with us tonight to be able to have this discussion. So, and I know that I did get a response from Senator Brooks, representative. She is not able to join us tonight, but we do have our two assemblymen. So if you would join me in welcoming Assemblyman Bronson and Assemblyman Meeks. Thank you. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to turn it over to them. I would ask that while they share a little bit at the beginning, if we could just let them share. At the end of them sharing, I will open it up for a question and answer period at the end. So,
great. Thank you so much for having us here today, and we're really honored to be able to have this discussion. It's an important discussion. I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't believe that the level of violence, in particular gun violence, in our neighborhoods is absolutely unacceptable, and we cannot let it to keep going on. We also, I think all in this room, believe that law enforcement is a key factor in addressing our public safety concerns, and we need to be supportive of law enforcement through funding and resources to make sure that they can do their job. That being said, we also have to be honest with ourselves on what is the cause of this increase in violence. And once we determine what the cause is, then what are the policy decisions, what are the funding decisions that have to be made to address the level of violence in our streets? So some of the things that we have worked on through the Assembly and the Senate and the Governor is supporting law enforcement, having the RPD, working with the Sheriff's Office, working with the Mayor's Office to make sure the New York State Troopers are involved, that federal law enforcement is involved, investing dollars to help the Mayor implement programs that will be supportive of law enforcement, will be supportive of what they're doing, but also supportive of preventive programs like teen empowerment and other programs to help our young people develop the skills to live in the community and be safe contributors to the community and things of that nature. I think that one principle we need to put in place is that we can have public safety, but we can also have justice in our criminal justice system. And when we enacted laws, Naman wasn't there for all of them. I've been there for all the laws that was mentioned. I was there for the bail reform in 2019, there for the reform of the bail reform, or the adjustment of bail 2020. I was there for Less is More, and I was also there when we raised the age, and I think that was in 2017. In all of the areas, bail reform in particular, and the Less is More, what we were trying to do is acknowledge that individuals make mistakes, they can be charged with crimes, but part of helping them and helping our communities is to help them either reintegrate into society if they've been in prison, or in the bail situation, recognizing that bail predominantly was allowing people who could afford to continue to be in the streets once they've been arrested. They could do that because they could come up with the funds to post bail. But those who couldn't do it ended up going in jail. We also know that the data shows that it's predominantly people of color, black and brown people, who end up being the people who can't afford the bail and end up in jail, pre-trial pending their trial coming up. That disparity is unacceptable. We should not be basing who goes to jail on whether you can afford to stay out or not. Let me just give you 2 examples. So you have a person who can afford bail arrested for a crime, and that person can afford bail, so they get to go home and be in the street. The person who can't afford the bail goes to jail. How is that answering safety in our streets? If you can cough up $2,000, you can go back on the street, so we don't really care about that. So, and again, that, the evidence showed that predominantly was people of color who ended up spending time in jail. So the bail reform basically is very complicated, it's difficult to understand, and there's all kinds of anecdotal situations that people will point out that don't like bail reform. But bail reform basically said that we're not going to have cash bail in most situations when somebody's arrested. Cash bail will be reserved for violent felonies and some violent misdemeanors, but mostly violent felonies. Otherwise, we're going to say you're going to be released on your recognizances. And what we did, though, to balance that policy issue, we increased the ability for judges to have what's called non-monetary conditions of release. So that can include pretrial services that they have to attend. It could be certain restrictions on firearms, and it can be monitoring, putting ankle bracelets on them to monitor the person out in the community. So we increased the ability of judges to use those non-monetary conditions, but at the same time said, we're gonna reduce your ability to require cash, money, in order for somebody to go back on the streets. So in 2019, I'm just gonna read this so I make sure I have it correct. So the law did not do away with pretrial detention for all charges. It still allowed bail for people accused of violent felonies as well as certain misdemeanors. Those would be misdemeanors with certain violence and sex offenses, including alleged domestic violence and all sex-related charges. Bail also could be set for people who have been released and persistently skipped court dates, violated a protective order, or are arrested on a second felony. So that was the original law. In 2020, there were some rollbacks because we listened to what was happening. There were some unintended consequences. There were some rollbacks, and so we expanded the categories of people who are eligible for bail. And that expansion were those, anybody charged twice with any alleged offense involving harm to a person or property, including shooting a house. It can also be set for people on parole or probation. So if you're on parole or probation and you commit a crime, bail could be set based on the 2020 changes. Those rollbacks took effect in July 2020. So it's a balancing act here. And we are trying to keep the public safe, but we're also trying to mitigate the harm that incarceration, even if it's a jail, pretrial incarceration or detention, we're trying to mitigate that harm. Because, number one, our overall principle in this country is you're innocent until proven guilty. That's number one. Number two is we know that if somebody's in jail, they're not able to go back to work. They're not able to provide for their family. They're not able to take care of their kids. And there is a snowballing effect that does more harm, not only to that family, but other community members if people are in jail. We also know that, and all the data shows that when someone has been incarcerated, even if it's a pretrial detention in jail, they're more likely, once back in the community, to commit another offense. We also know that the Office of Court Administration has pointed out, and let me make sure I get this data correct, putting aside all the anecdotal stories, the Office of Court of Administration data found that less than 1% of people released pretrial after bail reform were rearrested on a new firearm charge. And we know that overall, the pretrial rearrest rates are virtually identical to the rearrest rates in 2019 before bail reform. So all the postings you see, all the rhetorical and anecdotal statements you see, so-and-so was stopped for a traffic violation, arrested for possession of a loaded firearm, and they were released. The most important data is those releases have not increased after bail reform compared to pre-bail reform. So if we want to talk about the increase of violent crime, and in particular gun use, then let's really talk about the cause. We're getting caught up about talking about the criminal justice reforms that were put in place. And I'm certainly willing to talk about unintended consequences and things of that nature. But let's really talk about what the cause of this increase in crime is. Number one, even those of us who aren't researchers and scientists, ask yourself this question. If bail reform is the cause of the increase in the level of violent crimes in our streets here in the city of Rochester, then why in the county of Erie and the city of Buffalo, under the exact same laws, have they seen a decrease in violent crimes? Moreover, why are our numbers very similar to cities across the entire country in states that didn't do any type of criminal justice reform? So all of that data plus the OCA data suggests that it's not bail reform and the other criminal justice reforms. So what is it? Criminologists and researchers across the country are showing that much of this is related to the impact of COVID-19, destabilization of families, having family members die, having economic adverse impact, and mental health conditions of our folks in our neighborhoods. It's also related, in particular here in the city of Rochester, with the level of illegal guns that are in this city, the level of gang violence in this city, and the despair that many people feel in the city. So there are unique things in the city of Rochester, and there's overall issues that are affecting many cities across the country. That's what we need to focus our time on. So yes, let's support law enforcement. Let's help them do their jobs, because we have to have an immediate response to this crisis right now. But we also have to have longer term response with community-based services that are going to help our families, help our young people, and move us forward. So I've said a lot, and I will turn it over to Devon to repeat everything I said.
Thank you, Harry. I'm Assemblymember Meeks, representing 137. There's a number of things you touched on. I just want to drive home the fact that bail reform is a cashless bail system for nonviolent crimes. Again, it's a cashless bail system that's based upon nonviolent crimes. Some of the reforms or amendments that we made to that legislation since I've been here are related to making, if you get caught with a gun, it's a Class A felony. Whether it has bullets in it, well, without a gun with no bullets is a Class E felony. So another thing people tend to confuse is when you see things in the media that says, oh, this person did X, Y, Z, and they were released on bail. That's not bail reform. They were arrested and they were actually released on bail. So someone had to pay for them to get out of jail. And sometimes we see instances where family members, it may be an extremely high bail and a family member put up their house and get that individual out. But with the numbers we've seen with bail reform since it's been implemented, 96 to 98% of those individuals released on bail reform actually comply with the law in the manner that it was intended. Just giving examples, as Harry stated, I was not in the assembly when bail reform was first passed. However, I did support it. I was a labor organizer representing nursing homes here in this community with 1199 SEIU, and experienced firsthand where a young lady, single mother, went shoplifting and was arrested. So when she was arrested, she was given bail and couldn't quite afford the bail, so ended up sitting in jail for a week or two. So what that did was it further perpetuated poverty, because while she was in jail, she was a no-call, no-show. So she immediately lost her job. But you compare a person like that with someone on Wall Street, get caught with a DWI, $5,000, $10,000 bail they're out within the hour. So when that legislation was passed, individuals like myself in this community supported the legislation because we were advocating to push back against poverty and an unjust system. Less is more. That's something that I supported. I definitely feel it was needed. And I have a number of different ways that I think we could, you'll have an opportunity to speak. I see you shake your head back there. What we did in looking at the research, and most of these laws that were passed, it took about 6 years or so before it was implemented. It wasn't a thing of, oh, we think it's a great idea, let's pass the legislation. There was research that went into it. We had some members of law enforcement locally that said no one called them, but they had support of other counties. So you had sheriffs and chiefs of police from other counties throughout New York State, just not necessarily Monroe County. At least that's what they said here in Monroe County. But with less is more, one of the things that stood out to me in voting for that legislation, we found that we were spending upwards of $680 million annually to send individuals back to prison for technical violations. So that means they did not commit a new crime, but before marijuana was legalized, you had a dirty urine, you were smoking weed. Or your curfew was, say, 8 o'clock, and I'm your parole officer, I came here, you wasn't home by 8 o'clock, and it's been more than one occasion, but you was not home by 8 o'clock. I'm gonna violate you. You had 3 to 5, you served 3 and was released. I'm gonna let you go serve the other 2, or some of that time. So personally, I think that if we had $680 million to spend in some of our more impoverished communities, I think we could create some great outcomes, including things such as the housing project that you're working on. So we've seen these type of practices go into play. I also brought packets. Vivica, if you could share that information. We brought factual data that you can all read, and you can also go to the sites and look up the information when you have time to make decisions, because I know that we're often influenced by what we hear and what we see, and we have individuals who are considered trusted messengers. And when trusted messengers say that something is the case, we tend to believe that and go with that. So we're gonna get that information out, and I really wanna open up the floor because I know people already have their views and their opinions, and we're gonna give you this data, but I definitely wanna hear from you all.
Okay, so thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you coming in and sharing. For our question and answer time, I am gonna ask, since we do only have a limited amount of time, please keep your question brief and to the point. And I am also gonna ask, if you don't mind, trying to keep answers as brief and concise, with of course being able to answer, but so we can get through as many questions as we can.
I also should state this, as it relates to violence, I think we also have to come to grips and recognize the different forms of violence that exist within our community. Food insecurity is a form of violence. Unstable housing is definitely a form of violence that we deal with and we see on a regular basis in our community. And there was a recent study in our school district that showed that grades K through 8, 10% of our children were reading and math proficient. I consider that a form of violence, because the question is, what are the future outcomes for those students who are not reading up to par? And there's been studies after studies that show that if students aren't reading at grade level by the time they're in 3rd grade, it's not likely without the proper resources that they'll ever get there. So I think we need to take those things into consideration as well.
All right, so questions.
Ms. Lori.
Lori first, and just give us your name and what street you live on, and then brief question.
Lori, Hayward Avenue. Bail reform doesn't even begin to address the problem, because the situation with the justice system in our country is deplorable. So why is it we're not talking about legislation that actually creates effective change in our system of justice, instead of just trying to do acupuncture on it, okay? You are in a position now to actually affect real change that we fought for in the 60s and 70s. Why aren't we acting towards that? We know that it's the system of education. Jamon just pointed it out. Okay? Why aren't we enacting legislation that forces us to properly educate our children? Why aren't we enacting legislation that forces us to take a humanistic view towards this violence that we're experiencing, instead of a legalistic view? Because we're not talking about crimes, we should be talking about people. And until we begin to talk about people, and until we begin to reach our children and our young adults, all of this is moot. None of this is gonna make a big difference in any way. Just like you said, things haven't changed, and they won't, and COVID had nothing to do with it.
Well, thank you, Lori. Certainly, I think you're right. We have to have a comprehensive approach to this. Damon alluded to it. It's education, it's healthcare, it's mental health services, it's community-based services, it's making sure that when we're looking at our systems, we look at them through a social and racial justice lens, and that we address the systemic discrimination that is there. And so these pieces of legislation were intended to address the manifestations of that, but you're right, we have a lot of work to do with the systemic problems that we have. And this is only a portion of it. We have a lot of work to do.
So there's some things that, actually some legislation that I signed off on, and other things that I'm actually supporting. And when you talk about the history of it, I think it goes back even before the Civil Rights Movement. When you look at the 13th Amendment, right, it says that you can have slavery by way of a penal system. So while we went away from chattel slavery, we went to a penal system that allows slavery, where people make cents on an hour, right? Cents on $1 an hour, opposed to an hourly wage, such as the minimum wage at least. So those are some of the things that myself and some others are actually looking at as it relates to changing that language in New York State regarding slavery in our penal system. We've had about 8 other states that have changed that language in their state constitutions and implemented some different measures, and that's something that I'm actually researching now and working with others on.
My name is Charlotte, and I live on Copeland Street. And I understand about all the data every place else, but I'm talking about here in Rochester. What is the percentage, since y'all go by the data, since these people had bail reform? What did they do positive? What did you do to get help for these people that already in the system come from bail reform, and the ones that is continuously doing the crime? Because I have been, I have my own home, and I have been have problem. I think I had one good year out of 24 years I've been in my home because of the situation, because everybody wants to get to know their neighbors and all like that. But if your neighbors got bad behavior and their children got bad behavior, none of these laws can't touch it.
That's right.
Can't do nothing. I have to suffer with that. You know, percentage don't mean nothing to me when I still see the same problem and it's escalating every day. You know, the shooting is barely, you know, I'm out of my house. I gotta go in. I fence myself in. I put myself on lockdown because I figure once you cross my gate, you are now my problem. That's how I look at it now. So to me, all of that doesn't mean a bill of heat if y'all not doing anything.
That's right.
And all this money that's floating around with these different organizations, I ain't see a paper yet that has been out to the neighborhood to say, if you see things, to contact somebody. I mean, everything's kind of like repeating itself, but you have nobody to contact. And I hear a lot of talk, and that's all it is. I like to see some feet and hands moving fast. Because this is enough. I'm fed up with all the meetings and the talking and what you gonna decide. I ain't seen nobody come to my house and talk to me as a person, as a homeowner, that you gonna decide what is good for me. And that's not right. So you need to get up, stop this mess, and get a move.
Well, I can tell you, I may not have made it to your house, but I'm one who commit to town hall meetings, and I've held several town hall meetings throughout the district. You know, one of the things you stated yourself is that we can't legislate ourselves out of every situation. And you mentioned some of the things that are going on in your community, and one thing I believe in is in a higher power, and I also believe in showing that power of that higher power within myself. So sometimes just spreading a little love in the community. You mentioned how certain people in your community act, but sometimes it's a reaction to how people act towards them. So what I would suggest is sometimes just reaching out and just speaking some life into one of the young folks that may be coming from a tougher situation, or prepare a meal or two and share that with them and engage them, opposed to just, you know, looking at them as the other. Because that tends to be a challenge in our communities. Yeah.
The basic is gone. You know, let's deal with the real situation here.
And I've tried reaching out, so
That doesn't
I've
have
tried to work with Team Power.
Well, listen, before I leave tonight, I'd like to get your address, and I'd like to come by and talk and hang out on your porch sometime.
So I think, John, you've done what we've asked you to do. You came, you shared the background on Raise the Age, Less is More. You shared some of that background. I think the second part of that is, where can we go from here? Because while you are not responsible for what's happening, in the last 24 hours in our city, we've had 2 homes shot into with young children inside. We've had a student at one of our city schools shot at today at school.
I gotta interject, because it sounds like the campaigns that we just were dealing with. And I think it goes back to community members actively engaging, right? We could sit there and say, hey, this is the problem, because there was a whole campaign that was ran against me that said I was responsible for an off-duty officer being shot, right? Hear me out. So with that, it takes a collective. It takes a collective of us as a community recognizing, like the sister mentioned, her particular neighborhood, her street. So if there's a group of unruly young men or young women that she's dealing with on a regular basis, she said it's been, 24 years? Like, how is that the case? So what are we doing as a collective to say, hey, how can we give them some of the resources? Because, and the officer in the back may be able to attest to this, but when you look at some of the individuals who are actively engaged in the violent crimes, and you do the research, it's nothing new as it relates to family experience. So this person may be engaged in this type of activity while dad is in prison for 25 years for a similar activity. So when we see challenges, I believe that as a community, if we took on the responsibility of looking at the perpetrator of a crime as well as the victim of a crime and connecting them to resources for a minimum of 1 year to get them the assistance that they need to be better in the situation, I think those type of things actually help.
So I think we're looking for, so Damon, if you misunderstood me, I'm not trying to go on some campaign against you. That's not what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
What I'm trying to do is simply say, we are at these meetings every month, we're hearing of these things, they are growing exponentially. We're in a community where, like, honestly, we made tremendous strides. Beechwood, from where Beechwood was, 15, 20 years ago to where Beechwood was 3, 4, 5 years ago as it relates to violent crime, night and day. A violent crime in Beechwood had gotten to the point where it was absolutely the exception as opposed to the norm. The last couple of years, it has become much more the norm. People in our community are frustrated. They're feeling very frustrated. They're feeling unsafe in a lot of ways. We are doing everything we can from a community perspective. We're working with our PD. We're trying to work with others. We're at the point we know you guys hold tremendous power. There's a lot of, whether it's right information, misinformation, we're trying to figure it out. That's why we invite you two in, as well as Senator Brook, to be able to get your perspectives, but also to say, whether it had anything to do with this legislation or not, what, in your position of power, can you contribute and help us as we continue to try to move forward to get to a place where we are safe, where again we can have places of worship, our homes, our schools can be sanctuaries where no one has to worry about being shot at those locations. None of us like that. I'm not saying you guys do. I'm not pointing the finger at you guys. We are simply here, I think, trying to say, what, if it has nothing to do with this, throw bail reform out the window, what can we do from this point moving forward, so that, because the trauma that we're experiencing, I hear some of these other stats too. I also see trauma like I've never seen it before in our schools and in our kids and in families. And every time that there is a victim of violence that affects an entire community of people, and it's, you guys know that, it's sad. So somehow we gotta all work together. And I want to just make sure I personally am not pointing fingers, working to be collaborative, but also working to, I know you guys have been spending hours and hours and hours in this conversation. So I'm also hoping, what wisdom can you glean forward in terms of what we might be able to do to help this situation so that violent crime gets back to levels where it was the exception, not the norm. That's our hope.
All right, so I get you, and I think that's correct. The problem, however, we just spent a whole year wasted, absolutely wasted, because we were blaming the wrong thing as the cause of the problem, and that's because politics got involved in all of this. And so the discussion was all bail reform, less is more, raise the age. All three of those, are there unintended consequences that have to be addressed? I would say yes, but those three things are not the cause of the increase in violence in the city of Rochester. We have to look at the causes, and I know Ms. Lloyd disagreed with me, but there's all kinds of research that says the trauma that you were just talking about, there's lots of different manifestations of trauma, and there's lots of different causes of trauma, and one of them has been the COVID pandemic. And we're, the city of Rochester is not unique. This is happening in cities across the country. New York State is not unique. It's happening across the country. So what I think Damon agrees with me, what we want to do is to continue to work with the mayor, work with our PD chief, and be supportive of law enforcement, because key role in addressing this is law enforcement. They have to respond to your calls. They have to take care of the immediate threat and danger. But we as a community, and working with community members, we have to invest in community-based programs that are supportive of individuals, especially those who are at risk of committing these offenses. We have to get illegal guns off the street. That involves law enforcement. I don't have the data, but I've been told that we have removed significantly more illegal guns in the city of Rochester over the last 12 to 18 months as compared to prior to that. We are trying to address the gang violence and the drug trafficking that's happening in the city. That has a law enforcement component, but it also has a community-based component that's more long-term. So, I'm just giving you a couple of examples of, the immediate response is law enforcement, but we also have to have a long-term response. And that's where the community things that Damon was just talking about, we truly have to invest in that, but we also need community members to be helpful in that.
Jennifer had her hand up.
Two quick things. One is you mentioned pretrial services. It would be helpful to know what that is and what's an expanded vision of like how those could be used as the non-monetary, protections, and hopefully getting people back on a better track, and addressing those root causes. And then the other thing is just what can be done, what is being done about understanding the corporate manufacturers of guns that are profiting off of death in our communities. They may be illegal guns, but they were at some point legal, except for the ones, I guess, that are being 3D printed nowadays. But how are we looking at that?
I can't give you the details of the law, but it was either last year or the year before, we did pass a law in New York State that was signed into law by the governor that gives a mechanism to hold gun manufacturers liable. I can't give you the details on under what circumstances, but we have tried to capture the gun manufacturers. There is, and I don't know if microstamp got signed into law, do you remember?
I don't believe
The science isn't great with microstamping, but that is to try to identify from the bullet a microstamp that would come from a particular gun. Again, the science isn't quite there, but we're trying to push that. So there are other avenues that we're looking at. However, and I can't give you the particulars because I'm not aware of the particulars, but I do know that the mayor and the RPD with the police chief, the sheriff's office, federal law enforcement, and New York State law enforcement have set up strategies to address the illegal guns coming into the state from other states.
Question here.
You mentioned that,
Name and street, sorry.
Deborah. Cedarwood Terrace.
Thank you.
You mentioned COVID as part of the issue. How do you see COVID impacting the violence and the problems in this area?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna read from a study that, and it's many researchers have made this concluded rise in shootings is almost certainly driven by the massive societal disruptions occasioned by the pandemic, such as loss of family members, greater economic suffering, and overall instability of the community that negatively impacted the family and community ties that typically they rely on. So isolationism of individuals, an inability to rely on your families and your other community members because you're separated from them, all those, and the economic uncertainty, which we know economic uncertainty in many situations increases the level of crime. So it's those kind of things why they're, and the trauma that is the resulting and the manifestation of losing a loved one and not having your community support to rely on. So that's and look, that's not me, but that's people who are experts in the science of crime across the country are making that conclusion.
Go ahead.
So I am a clinical social worker. I totally understand what you're saying in terms of the cause and effect. But I think just like a practical example of our porch pirates, where we knew where they lived, we knew what they looked like, The community got together, took pictures. There was lots of information that stealing was going on. So I think we have banded together as a community to try to address some of these issues. But what happens when that is not actually followed up on, or maybe there's some follow-up, but there's nothing that can actually be done to prevent that from happening. And then there is the aspect of personal safety, because I've run into the porch pirates myself, snap pictures, things like that. And maybe 2 years ago, I might have gotten out of my car and had a conversation, but now there's a level of, I just don't know where people are. And so I think that's a tangible example of an issue that we've seen in this community that we've not been able to address with the strategies that you've suggested. So I think that's where some of the frustration is coming from.
Lieutenant Wilson, could you update the Assembly members on those porch pirates, how many times they were arrested and what the consequences were for them? Just so they're aware, I want them to know the scenario that LaShawn is talking about.
First of all, I have no idea. I don't know if they've ever been arrested, partially because in order to have someone arrested, you have to have a victim, right? So a lot of times they're gone before we even know where the stuff comes from. They ditch packaging, so they don't have the package on them. That's why it's not the easiest to catch them. I'm honestly more worried about, I'd like to come up and kind of have equal time with these two gentlemen about kind of the counterbalance of this, because there's a lot of things that kind of rub me the wrong way with this, right? Like one of the things they're talking about, less is more, which for those that don't know, parole is for someone that's been incarcerated, right? And the idea of parole, at least in my little mind, in 27 years of law enforcement experience, is a way to integrate people back into society, right? So when someone comes out, we just don't say, good luck, right? So we give them barbaric, unreasonable things they have to do. Get an education, get a job, not use drugs, not hang around other criminals, right? Those are the technicalities we're sending people back to jail. And I'm sorry if my voice is cracking, but I see the homicide victims, right? 84 the year before, 76 this year. Who were those victims? What race are they? 75% or more are people of color. That's unconscionable. Why are we allowing this to happen?
Exactly.
So I apologize if I'm a bit emotional, because this really rubs me the wrong way. Bail reform is an issue because we see people getting released and committing more violent crimes. As a police officer, a dedicated public servant, trying to keep people safe, we're seeing people that not everyone needs to go to jail, of course. Not everyone that gets out is committing more crimes, right? Looking at this data, right, there's 13 pages they handed out. It would have been great to have ahead of time. I made a few notes. I'll leave it at that. When we can't, as a police officers, we can't keep the community safe because people that are committing violent crimes are getting back out. Some of the data talks about only 1 or 2% of people, right? That's everyone that's arrested. We're talking about the violent criminals that are arrested, they're getting back out and committing more violent crimes. Of course you can water it down. If you talk about every person that's arrested, most people that are arrested probably aren't going to commit crimes. Unfortunately, it's a very small percentage of people committing the violent crimes are also committing the crimes again, right? They have the propensity. So they're going back out and doing that again. That's one of the things that drives me crazy.
Ask a question?
Yes, sir.
You asked us to come here tonight, right? Did he ever have an opportunity to speak to the community?
Lieutenant Wilson comes every month and
Every month.
provides updates.
Okay,
and
every month. So can we continue with our time? I'm just asking a question, like, we're state representatives, because the question was posed, what can we do to affect change? But we never had an opportunity to speak to that, because you said.
Would love to do it, go ahead.
Okay, but, I mean,
Well,
okay.
let me do this though, because, this is another example of misinformation. So let me read what's actually in the statute on less is more and what's considered a technical
That's
violation.
what they doing. He broke
Violation
it down,
of
so we can talk
curfew.
about it. He's
Violation of
emotional.
curfew.
He's sharing that. So that's how we
So-
got back here.
So violation of curfew, meaning you didn't get home at 10 o'clock when you were supposed to be there. Alcohol and substance use, unless it's in connection with driving under the influence. So if it's driving under the influence, it's not a technical violation. But if you end up using some pot or some other drug, it's a technical violation. So do we want to put somebody back in prison just because they used again? Do we want to put somebody back in prison because they didn't show up at 10 o'clock at home when they were supposed to? How about this one? Failure to notify the parole officer of a change of employment status.
They shouldn't have been picked up in the first place.
These are, wait a minute though, these are people who are on parole, but the question is, on a technical violation, do we want to automatically send them to prison for these kind of violations? Let me give you another one. Driving a car without a valid license. Failure to notify a parole officer that you had a contact with a police officer unless your failure to notify is intended to hide illegal behavior. So if a police officer, you have a conversation with a police officer and you didn't tell your parole officer on this thing, under the old law, they could just send you back to prison. So this is what we're talking about. It's not, and then the other thing, the volume of misinformation. It is horrible. One of my friends was killed by somebody on parole. That's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But it's also wrong to say merely because we're making the parole system more fair to truly help people reintegrate into society. And I'm a person who ran transitional houses for 3 years, 2 of them here in Rochester and 1 in Buffalo, to help people get back into their community and to be with their family. That's important. But it's misleading to suggest somehow that most of the violent crime in this city is happening because people aren't being released not on cash bail or because they're being released on parole. Are there examples of both of those? Absolutely. The real question to ask yourself is, what is the data today compared to the data before we did those reforms? And I already told you, it's essentially the same.
So let's like the brother said earlier, absent of the data, absent of what have you. Everyone here lives in the Beechwood area or somewhere in the city of Rochester. By a show of hands, how many people seen a construction project in their community? Show of hands. Okay. Show of hands. How many people seen majority of the people on that construction project as people of color? So when we talk about some of the challenges and the violence in our community, let's also talk about neglect in our community. We've seen the first part of the inner loop filled in. Now we're moving towards the second part of the inner loop. We've secured upwards of $100 million for that. But in securing that $100 million, we've also had conversations about what we expect the PLA agreement to look like. But outside of that, we have a responsibility as members of this community to ensure that people have opportunity. Another thing, Rochester Police Department, we push legislation and maybe we have to do it by way of a referendum. But one thing that I've found is when people live in a community, they have more of a vested interest. Again, when people live in a community, they have more of a vested interest of that community. In my personal experience, as a 43-year-old African-American male, my experience in Rochester, New York, I felt as if the police department is an occupying force. I feel like individuals come in from outside and they police us in a manner that they choose to, and they recognize us as blacks, as the other. And that's a challenge, and I suffered an injury at that here 2 years ago, based upon that. So when you have people that live in the community, that have a vested interest in the community, that also recognize racial justice and have those type of trainings, you see a different dynamic in the way the community is policed. As a community member, I called the police department, that was this past Friday. A landlord pepper sprayed a neighbor. Someone take a wild guess at how long it took the police department to arrive. It took 4 hours. It took 4 hours, right? And when they got there, they said it was a shift change and what have you. But in the meantime, as a community member, Me and my wife, we intervened and we talked the people through the situation to try to bring down the level of tension that existed there. So it goes back to what I said initially. Sometimes we can engage, but I also believe that we also have to change the dynamics of having people live in the community that also serve the community. And you see a difference in outcomes within our community. I seen a hand back there.
So you raised a scenario that I've experienced myself when you're intervening in a tense situation, waiting for RPD to arrive, or like maybe they're hadn't been called yet, people are debating calling.
Yes.
What guidance or protections are there for the civilians intervening that, like, my dad hates it that I would even consider going outside when my neighbors are yelling at each other, right?
Yep.
From a perspective of, and this is kind of to the RP as well.
Sometimes that's based upon your relationship with a person.
Yeah.
Like if you don't have a relationship at all with a person, I wouldn't suggest intervening. But if you have a respected relationship with your neighbor, and you may be able to say, hey, come in for a minute, let me get some milk on your face, here's a glass of water, and calm that person down. So it is not based upon any situation, but a respected and trusted relationship plays a part.
Can I ask a question, a follow-up to yours?
Yes.
I think it's, obviously, ideally, having more officers. I mean, nothing I enjoy more than seeing one of my students serving in the public service sector, whether it's RPD, fire departments, like that's awesome, right?
Yeah.
But I guess I'm kind of a realist. I'm looking at RPD, which is down how many officers? 100.
Yeah.
So they're down, they don't have a full force, they're down 100. It's kind of similar to city school teachers, right? So Damon, great idea. I guess I'm just kind of like, how do you try to enforce that if we don't even have that in place now and we have a department that is down 100 officers? How in the world do we possibly keep a police force if we're then gonna have a residency
So my
requirement?
background is labor organizing, so it wouldn't happen overnight. So individuals like your officer here, if he doesn't live in the community, in the city as of now, he wouldn't be required to move in the city. He would be grandfathered in. But individuals who are new applicants to the police department, they would be required not only to live during the application process, but beyond. Because also another thing is when we talk about resources in this community, I mean, we bring resources from the state of New York, but our tax base is also a form of resources. So if you have a police department with a $95 million budget, right, and everyone or majority of the police officers live outside the city, that means that money is immediately going outside the city. So then you question, well, do we do a commuter tax or something?
I
But
don't
if they
know,
live
without
here,
major
that's more
incentives,
resources
I don't
for
know
them.
how because right now we're 100 short, they could apply from anywhere.
Yeah.
And
So.
you're right, we have to address the shortage.
Yeah.
Right.
It's bad for the officers, it's bad for the communities,
And then you get 4-hour wait times. There's nothing more for us. I had to do it too, like, right?
That
You get gunshots going and it takes forever for police to respond.
And
It's frustrating.
the reality is because we have the level of violent crime, that takes up the time of the law officers because they have to prioritize that, rightfully so. But then when you have the other calls, they're not able to respond.
So this is very important discussion. We ultimately they have to close up lockout by 9 o'clock. So I'm gonna go like last two questions real
I
fast.
told my boss I'd be home at 8:30.
And then we have to close up. So Cheryl and then in the back.
Okay, so I think this is the key point. So my focus is not on the stats or anything. Mine is when these officers are doing the best they can with the arrest, they're making the arrest. The issue is not them in the arrest, it's what's happening after, or what's not happening after the arrest. And that's where we need legislative change.
It's interesting you mentioned the legislative change, and one of the things Harry presented earlier was what we see happening at other counties. So it could go back to your district attorney and what they're requesting as it relates to what type of penalty, or are they asking for a remand, are they asking for a certain type of bail? So it applies, the legislation that was passed applies to the state of New York, and it's operating one way in one county versus this county. So what I would suggest is maybe there's a need, and I've already reached out to the AG office, but she told me there's another office that I need to reach out to pertaining to the courts. But there may need to be an investigation of some sort as to why are things operating or being applied this way in Rochester versus other places. So for instance, when we had there was laws already in place before we had the rent moratorium that was being applied a certain way in New York City and other parts of the state, but it wasn't happening here in Rochester. So there was a need for state legislation to go across the full board and say there's a rent moratorium across New York State. And that's based upon interpretation of different individuals as it relates to the law that they're reading.
So I will reiterate what I said earlier. When we went to a predominantly cashless bail system, so to balance that, we gave judges more authority. They're not using it to the extent they should. More authority to have non-monetary conditions. And I mentioned these before. They're travel restrictions, firearm restrictions, mandatory participation in pretrial services, and electronic monitoring. Now, there is a debate that's happening, and it's a valid debate. In the law, we also said that they're required to use the least restrictive means. All right?
Why?
Well, wait, let me just tell you where the debate is. So many in law enforcement and many in the judicial area are saying, oh, you just tied our hands. Bunk. Absolute bunk. That provision, least restrictive means, is in the Constitution of New York State. All we did was use the exact same language and put it in the statute. So they've always been under the purview of using the least restrictive means when it comes to pretrial release. So we gave them other tools, and the other is status quo. So we are having conversations with the Office of Court Administration and with the judicial system in general to help have educational programs and examples set up on how judges can use the new law that actually will help with the public safety issue that we're talking about with non-monetary conditions of being released.
Last question in the back.
So I just hear like a lot going on with like we're shortage of police and we need more police this, more police that, whatever the case may be. And honestly, like from the start, police was not in place for people that look like me. And honestly, like even before all this bells or whatever the case may be, police and the community have not had a good relationship to begin with. So I'm just trying to figure out like more police, whatever the case may be. What are we doing to build those relationships between the community and the police officers? Period. Like, because it's talking about more police here, more police there. Honestly, like I work with youth. I've worked in the city school district for 5 years. I've worked with youth now at Teen Empowerment. So like a lot of what I hear is like the COVID thing definitely is an issue, or definitely was an issue. Kids was socially shut down for 2 years, not able to speak to no one, only deal with their families. Again, we have summer programs, summer meals where meals are given out because families aren't able to distribute food as well because kids are home. So I definitely understand where you guys coming from with COVID being an issue or whatever the case may be. But again, like as community members and like they're saying, and we have like feel free, talk to me after this, whatever the case may be. We have plenty of youth that come in that you might look at on the community and think like, oh no, I won't speak to them or whatever the case may be. They're disrespectful, whatever. But these young men and women that come in day to day are not cookie cutter people that we select. When they come in, they're youth off the street that you might see, and they're very, very respectful. So again, if you guys want to come in or whatever the case may be and sit in on one of our sessions and be a part of it, volunteer, whatever, we're definitely open to that. But another thing, like I said, I just wanted to figure out like what are we doing to build that relationship between the police and the community. And again, if you guys as community members too, we definitely have these conversations where it's like it would be nice to see some of these people, kids get up and go to school in the morning. They walking across the street or walking to their school or whatever the case may be on their own. Back in the day, there used to be people there, safety guards or whatever the case may be, that is there to greet them on their way to school. And we don't have that anymore. So I mean, again, if we're talking about getting and making those connections within the community, that's something that we can do. We get up 6, 7 o'clock in the morning and talking on the phone about all the gun violence or whatever is going on. So why we can't get up 6, 7 o'clock in the morning and make sure that our kids is getting to school safely and they see in our face. We all in this community. So what's the issue there? So again, if we're not going to do it ourselves and we asking for police officers to come in, police, then what are we doing to build that relationship between police and the community as well? That's all.
Last response, and then we gotta close.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree with you, we have to build those relations, and it, you know, we have to have conversations, we've had some conversations today. You know, it's a difficult situation. You know, we rely on police to do a lot, yet police also get attacked oftentimes as well. And we can't do that either, right? So we have to find forums where we can have tough discussions, honest discussions. You know, it's embedded in racism, which is very difficult. You know, but we have to be willing to put ourselves out there and have those discussions. I know a lot of law enforcement officers who are willing to do that. I know a lot of community members who are willing to do that. We just have to find the space and actually be willing to be vulnerable in our honest conversations with each other.
Damon, wanna say?
So I can just tell you, for me growing up, we had different programs that existed in the school, and I'm not talking about resource officers. We had McGruff the Crime Dog, we had Officer Friendly, who we had relationships with. We had the TOPS program. We also had a police community baseball league that existed within the community. We had the DARE program, where officers would be in the school on a regular basis, having conversations about drugs and its effects on members of our community. I remember some years ago going to central office asking why we no longer have the DARE program. They said there was no proof that the program actually worked, and it was a grant they used to apply for, they no longer apply for it. I also represent the town of Gates. They have a DARE program in Gates. Yeah, so, you know, some food for thought.
All right, folks, as we wrap up, first off, I want to say thank you to both of you. I know, and Devon, I have a feeling, and I would like to connect with you personally, because certainly I've sensed a little bit of, I want to talk to you personally at some point. Our intent here at Beechwood is to work in collaboration with our representatives, to work in collaboration with law enforcement, to make our community better and safer. And so we will continue our efforts to do so. But I know we have heard from you every single month about frustration around these issues. So thank you. Our next meeting is on Thursday, February, is that 2nd maybe? And it will be Mayor Evans right here at 7 o'clock, first Thursday in February.